So hello, everyone. Welcome to Mindful in Wall Street. We're very excited for the kickoff of our four-part series of mindful leadership skills with Dr. Jeremy Hunter. My name is Alice Kim from Morgan Stanley. For those of you who are new to who we are, Mindful on Wall Street is a grassroots collaboration of mindfulness champions across the financial services industry. And we seek to amplify the reach of mindfulness within our respective and peer institutions. One of our shared objectives at Mindful on Wall Street is to equip the individual with tools and techniques to reach their highest potential, to perform in our high intensity roles with greater ease. And this is why we are very excited to welcome Dr. Jeremy Hunter, who pioneered one of the first mindfulness-based approaches to personal mastery, and whose work redefines and enhances productivity by cultivating the quality of mind in our day-to-day actions and interactions, and to enhance self-awareness, self-regulation, and self-transformation. Dr. Jeremy Hunter is the founding director of the Executive Mind Leadership Institute at the Drucker School of Management of Claremont Graduate University. He's been voted Faculty of the Year 8 times by students, and when faced with life-saving surgery, 13 former students came forward as organ donors. And we were chatting just before, and the actual number was many more. Jeremy received his PhD from the University of Chicago under the direction of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, author of Flow, The Psychology of Optimal Experience, considered the grandfather of flow, which is the state of high performance. With that, I turn it over to Dr. Jeremy Hunter.
Thank you, Alice. And thank you to everybody for tuning in and spending your day with us. And thank you to the Mindful on Wall Street team. For those of you who are tuning in who may not know them, there are these band of good-hearted souls who really use their free time to put this program on. And so we have them to thank for all their many efforts in making this happen. So thank you to you all. In the chat, we will put a link, and I'd like you to click on that link. And so let's just start off, rather than me talking at you, I'd like to kind of get a sense of who you all are. And you will see, so there in the chat, click on that link that says pollev.com, and you will see something that looks like this. And so I'm just curious to know, like, what's your experience with mindfulness? And so just click on the place that that you think best describes you. There we go, good. Okay, some people with a regular practice, great. There we are, tumbling in. Yeah, beautiful. Okay, this is great. So only about a quarter of you've done this. So let's see if you get a couple more so we can get a sense of a good distribution. Yeah, there we go. All right. So there's a fair number of you who've had a regular practice. And looks like so somewhere between dabbler and regular practice are the largest chunk of folks. All right. Let's see. Okay, I'll leave it at that. And then, all right, so then we will go to the next one. That helps me a lot. Thinking about the events of 2020. What is one word to describe how you're feeling about your situation? So obviously, the bigger the word, the more people using that word. Anxious, frustrated, overwhelmed, tired, exhausted, uneasy, limbo, confused, blessed, right? Untethered, stagnant, feel lost, apprehensive, tired, fortunate, devastated. Yeah, powerful words. All right, powerful words. Let me make this a little slower, or a little smaller. So there's some cluster of gratefuls making a show for it. All these things, I've been doing these since March, and there's been a clear trend of moving in the beginning stages of all this from kind of fear and a lot of high energy to a great deal of uncertainty and being exhausted and overwhelmed. We'll talk more about that next week. So I'll leave it there just for a couple more moments. But this is really, again, they're powerful words and beautiful contribution. Okay. All right. Anxiety, overwhelm, gratitude, and tired and uncertain. Okay. Now, next one. So thinking about, we've 4 sessions planned. None of it is canned. So it's really up to your interest. Let's see here. What would you like to receive? Hope, clarity, mental focus, calm. Here you can use sentences actually if you want to type something in. Resiliency training, peace of mind, guidance. Let me say a little bit about resilience, which I think is a little different from how we approach things versus how you might have heard about it before. I think there's a lot of resiliency training out there that's primarily psychological, that focuses on what you think. I start in a different place, which is physiological, right? Which starts with your nervous system, right? You can't be resilient unless your nervous system is resilient. And so we're going to talk about that next week a bit. Like, how do you make a balanced nervous system first, right? Okay, to learn a mindfulness practice. Inner peace, community, yeah. Guidance, having calm, others, 84 results. We won't go through all 84, but this gives me a good sense. Ways to reframe the mindset to hopefulness. Okay, and we'll start with that next week. Some tools. Motivation to start to meditate. Okay. Slow down the mental chatter. I'll leave it up just for another 5 seconds or so. Managing stress, insight, practical tips. Yeah. Okay, beautiful. Thank you, everybody. So, as Alice kind of alluded to, how I got into this, I'll be 50 next year. And when I was 20, so almost 30 years ago, I found myself finishing my 2nd year of school. And at the end of the year, found myself sitting on a doctor's table at Cleveland Clinic being diagnosed with an incurable terminal autoimmune disease that was attacking my kidneys. And it's still incurable. And the prognosis was 90% chance of dying within 5 years. And I don't know what you were thinking about when you were 20, but let's just say mortality wasn't in my top 10. And for whatever reason, I saying to my father as we're walking out of the hospital, Dad, I guess 90% is good news because somebody's got to be in the 10%. And the fact that, at that point, science couldn't really save me, I decided to quite frankly, turn it into a spiritual journey. And to see, like, if I had this naive notion that maybe I could transform something within myself and maybe I would keep on living. And miraculously, I did that. I started to meditate. There's a book called The 3 Pillars of Zen by Philip Kapleau, which was the first book in English to teach Westerners how to do Zen. And I read that book religiously. My half of my family is Japanese, so I was an Asian studies major in college. My great-grandfather was a sumo wrestler, and I'm trying desperately not to have his body emerge from my own like alien. But in any case, Japanese culture kind of runs through my veins, and that book was one of the touchstones that really helped me, responding to a lot of the things that you all just wrote. It helped me deal with what was going on in my mind. You're 20 years old and suddenly you're faced with your mortality. Of course, there's going to be fear and anger and anxiety and uncertainty and all of that happening. And that was the starting point for really what became a 17-year journey in understanding how what's happening inside you directly affects what happens outside you. And that led into my teaching at the Drucker School and a big, long adventure in doing this and eventually sharing this with you today. So what I'd like to say is that if you have to leave early, the sum up is that the fear and pain that we might be experiencing on a day-to-day basis isn't your enemy, right? And if you know how to harness it, it can be the fuel for your own transformation. And I think it's clear to all of us now that we're at an inflection point in terms of our own future. And my hope is that the conversation we can have today can illuminate how that might happen for you personally, right? So here are some assumptions I kind of walk in the room with. One is that traditional, what we call education is grossly imbalanced towards thinking, right? I think, therefore I am. It's the statement of modern Western civilization, that we put most of our eggs in the education basket in the thinking box. And we do very little to train perception, to train emotion, to train sensation in the body, right? And so we're like we're like big heads on tiny little sticks. And at least that's what a University of Chicago education felt like a lot of the time, quite frankly. But we don't train systematically many of the aspects that are fundamentally human. And the next thing is that, when you're facing crisis, coping, I think, is not an ideal goal, right? When we're facing crisis, I think we have three options. One is collapsing, which is not really an option. The second is coping, right? It's just trying to getting by, kind of maintaining status quo, which I think in the end is not an option. Maybe it's a good short-term option. And then, so we only really have one choice, I think, which is transformation. And how do you use these challenges that we're facing as fuel for not just self-mastery, but for self-transformation? Like, how do we expand our sense of selves to be bigger than we are now, right? To have more capacity and capability than we do right now. Another core assumption is that your daily life is a powerful arena for growth. The approach I developed at the Drucker School, and one that I was also schooled in for many years before teaching this, was like how to apply mindfulness in daily life in a very systematic and rigorous way. So how do you go beyond when you're washing the dishes, wash your dishes, to understanding how is your mind creating a sense of your own reality in a given moment? How do you witness that? And then how in the moment do you kind of reel it back in or change it to create new options? And so what we're going to talk about in the next 4 sessions isn't primarily meditative, but rather like using your daily life and the craziness of your daily life as the means of practicing, right? It's not the thing you escape from to go meditate. It's the thing that you use to develop yourself. And that finally, that these aren't a nice to have, right? These aren't a kind of a nice extra or a luxury, but I think for obvious reasons now that have been kind of served up on a silver platter for us in 2020, that really they're the fundamental skills to be effective in this time. And in fact, one of my students came up to me and said, after the class was done, he said, "Oh, Prof, this is the license to do business in the 21st century," right? And I think now we kind of know why, given the events of the last 6 months. So let me tell you what we're going to do. So today, I'm just going to set the ground, right, to talk about, let's give a context for understanding why this stuff is so important. And then next week, we're going to talk about how do we navigate uncertainty and how do you start to manage energy in that. And I have to tell you, I had 17 years of practice doing this. The interesting thing about kidney disease is that it's mostly painless. It can mysteriously stabilize and just as mysteriously destabilize. And you don't know when it's going to happen. So, and, you know, not to be too graphic, but, you know, when blood starts showing up in your urine, that's when you know something bad is happening. So you can imagine every day you go to the bathroom and you wonder, okay, is this going to be the day today? And so 17 years of that really was a great training. It was like advanced graduate training in dealing with uncertainty and fear. And so next week, we'll kind of go deeper into that. Then in week 3, we're going to talk about resilience from the point of view of a nervous system, and how do you train yourself for kind of sustainable performance over the long run. And you start to see now, I think, as we enter the fall, that a lot of people's energy is running out, and that's what I've been seeing all over the place. And then in the last session, we'll talk about how do you create choices in daily life? You know, how do you be adaptive? And to me, this work is all about creating choices. This is about, I have 35 weeks that I teach at the Drucker School, probably the only business school in the world that makes some kind of mindfulness training a required thing. But this will get us probably about 2 weeks of that 35 weeks. But in any case, it'll be good. So goals for today, let's understand like why these skills are essential. So I don't know if you're new to this kind of thing, you know, what neighborhood it lives in your mind, but I find oftentimes in corporate contexts, it lives in a kind of wellness department, which of course is not bad, but there are also other departments that it could live in with strategy and dealing with the other humans that you have to encounter. How do you like Jeff Walker was talking about in the last talk, like how do you deploy your attention in effective ways in an organization, right? And then we'll talk about the 3 interlocking contexts that drive these needs, and then we'll start with the process of establishing a method to practice this anywhere, anytime. Okay, so let me invoke Peter Drucker, who I'm sure you all know is the founding father of the discipline of management. And you know, he had this idea that leadership is defined by results. So let's make it really concrete. Like, we're measured by the results that we create. And at the same time, we can't manage other people unless we manage ourselves first. And so which seems like a taken for granted notion, but where do we learn how to do that? If you put those 2 ideas together, you get something like this. You know, I like to tell people, you know, in life, you only have to do 2 things, right? You have to manage what goes on inside you, and you have to deal with what goes on outside you, right? And so traditionally, education, at least professional education, focuses on managing the outer game, right? And like you get the technical skills to do your job, and then it kind of generally ignores the inner game, or if it's not ignoring it, it downplays it, and we call it the soft skills or whatever. Of course, I have a different view, that I think that they're the hard skills of analysis and all that, and then there's the even harder skill of dealing with the other people in your life and most of all yourself, right? So how do you bring these 2 things together, right? You have to bring these things together, and you have to be able to do it real time, right? That to me is the goal of this kind of development process. So let me give you an example. A client of mine who works for a financial services firm is in a meeting with a key client of hers, multi-million-dollar client. And my client is known for her short temper. And somebody in this meeting says something inflammatory. A wave of anger shoots through the room, including through my client. She glances over at her client, and she notices that he is now picking up his papers and getting ready to leave, right? And if he leaves that room, her career goes with him. So in real time, she did what she practiced to do, which was she quickly put her attention on her palms on the tabletop, which gave her attention somewhere to go besides the anger she was feeling, right? That bought her a few moments to let that anger subside. Then she turned her attention outward into the room, acknowledged what everybody was experiencing, and then very skillfully shifted their attention in a positive direction. She looks back to her client, and his papers are down on the table, and he's sitting back in the chair, right? The day is saved. So when we talk about kind of mindfulness and action, this is kind of my archetypal example, right? Like, how do you be able to do this in real time? And that's what we, that's what we practice for. So this bit about now is really something that leadership development has, in a way, completely ignored or overlooked, right? And the reason why it's important is that all of your life is happening now. Now, I know that sounds like a Bay Area bumper sticker, but if you just pay attention, like all action is happening now, right? And for the most part, we tend to overlook it, and we're rarely ever given systematic skill to recognize what's happening now, and then recognizing how your actions now filter out or spill out or ripple out into your life, your team's life, your organization's life, your family's life, your community's life, right? So we focus on this moment. So my unit of analysis is the moment, right? And now you're starting to get a hint of how to practice this in daily life. Like, so if we don't know like what's happening inside us in any given moment, right? How is that influencing the choices that we perceive, the action we take, and eventually the result we get, right? So it's like driving down the street with a big piece of cardboard over your windshield, right? Not being able to really read in a very precise way what's going on, right? So this begs the question of like, well, who do you want to be, and what vision do you have of yourself? And that's, when I work with people, I often ask this question of like, who do you want to be, right? And let's create a vision of this person. And then that gives us something to as a touchstone for our own action, right? Because, this is a joke, so I hope you get it, right? But, we are contagious. And if you're the leader of the group, you're even more contagious. So, what you're putting into your network, right, will come back at you. And whether, something Jeff Walker talked about last time, your quality of attention, your quality of listening, right? Are you putting that into your network? Or, are you putting reactive emotions into your network? Just this morning, I had a conversation with somebody who works for a major pharmaceutical, and she had been receiving downright rude email from someone on her team. And she said, I could have gotten offended, I could have gotten angry, and I could have gotten super judgmental and been justified in all of those things. But I decided, no, I'm gonna shift in a different direction. And so I went and talked to her. I said, instead of using words like upset and angry and offended, I used words like, I'm kind of surprised and I'm concerned by the emails. And the colleague, because she wasn't being attacked, said, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that that's how people were reading this. And, but I've been under enormous stress at home. People in her life had passed away. She has many kids and not such a supportive husband. And, this is what's happening in the rest of my life. And then her boss said, well, what can I do to take some of this pressure off of you? And they came to an agreement. They walked away from that conversation feeling really good. The boss walked away from the conversation feeling very confident in her leadership skill. And then about 20 minutes later, that team member sent an email to the rest of the team, really apologizing for her actions and kind of setting a tone for, hey, let's be open about what's going on. And so when we talk about compassion and compassionate leadership, sometimes it's just about withholding the knee-jerk reaction that's going on inside you, shifting directions a little bit, and it totally changes the dynamic. So when I work with leaders, I say, hey, look, they often want to know how to fix my team. And I said, no, we're not going to worry about your team. We're going to worry about you, right? And because as you start to change, your team is going to change. And nobody believes it in the beginning, but kind of example after example, in this morning's case is another example, shows that when the leader is more grounded, more aware of what's going on inside himself or herself, right? What they put into the network shifts what comes back to them, right? So let's shift gears a little bit. So why do any of this stuff anyway, right? So I'm going to talk about 3 conditions that I think are pushing us towards developing these kind of skills. One is the condition of the world, right? And then there's the condition of work. which has changed dramatically. And I think we really haven't noticed that. And then of course, the good old human condition, right? So let's jump into it, right? So what's going on in the world? You probably have heard this acronym VUCA a million times by now. And in January, I've used this metaphor for 20 years, but for many people, it was kind of an abstraction, right? So what's VUCA, right? Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, right? And now, so it used to be an abstraction for a lot of people. Now this is everyday reality. And, think about in the last 6 months, in the last 7 months, how has this influenced your life, right? Probably every day, in many ways, multiple times a day, in increasingly unexpected sources. In fact, I need to tell you that I'm under evacuation warning because there's a large mountain fire a few miles from here. And so there's a possibility I could get up and leave, but hopefully that won't happen. But it does make life more interesting, doesn't it? So, VUCA demands adaptability. And if we had more time, we'd kind of talk about what does VUCA look like for you in your own life. But I think we all know that it's certainly there in some way or another, right? So that's the world condition. And then there's the condition of work, which I've been talking about now for 2 decades. And Peter Drucker, this was one of the big themes of Drucker's work, was that knowledge worker productivity. Like, okay, so what does that mean? Like people who use their minds to make a living, which I imagine is everybody on this call, right? Helping people that make their minds for a living is the 21st century management challenge, right? And in fact, he talked about it being the survival requirement of the developed economies, right? Well, how have we done, right? Quite frankly, we've done a terrible job at it, right? We do not know how to effectively manage people who use their minds for a living. And in fact, we know how to effectively mismanage people who use their minds for a living, right? And so you get all kinds of sickness, the rise of autoimmune diseases, all that sort of stuff, right, is part and parcel of I think what we've done wrong. Look, let's be honest, nobody ever wakes up in the morning and says, well, how can I be more productive today, right? I think what we do think about is like, how can I live a more meaningful life? How can I be closer to the people I love? How do I make a contribution to my work? How do I be an effective professional? But for what I've noticed is that it's not most people's number one goal. But there is a significant difference between the productivity of a manual worker working in a factory versus people who are in an office setting, right? In fact, even manual workers aren't manual workers anymore, right? It's a highly technological job, right? So, but in college, I worked at a metal plating factory, electroplating door hinges. And that job taught me a lot of stuff. And I think it prepared me to have this conversation right now. And so how do we think differently? How do we think about productivity? I think is still informed largely by factory work, right? Think about what factory work is. You know exactly what you have to do. You can focus your attention. In fact, that was the whole point of the job, right? You only had to do one thing. You didn't need to know how to make a car. You needed to know how to turn this bolt. And somebody else did their thing, and somebody else did their thing, and at the end of it, you got a car, right? So attention focus was built in the job. You could concretely measure exactly how well you've done, right? I could count the door hinges I had electroplated. Work was largely solitary, nobody bothered me, and at 3:30, I went home, and I didn't think about door hinges unless I had post-traumatic dreams about them, right? So, and that the signature emotion was being bored. Right? And so part of that was like, how do I think of things to entertain myself while I'm electroplating these door hinges? Now, contrast that to knowledge workers and people who use their minds to make a living, right? And so the asset is you, right? It's not necessarily the proprietary software you have, it's you. And it's you in relationship with other people, right? So knowledge work, and I think this is something we haven't really embraced, is inherently social, right? It's inherently relational. So when Jeff last week talked about, or last episode kind of talks about compassion, right? When you start to see that your work is inherently part of this interrelated network, then we have to think about what's the quality of relationship, right? And that's a big thing. And where do we get, all of my clients are all service firms, basically. And the thing that they have in a number of different industries, but the thing that they have come to clearly recognize is that their business is built on relationship. And the reason why they do this kind of training is to get better at being in relationship, which means first starting with the relationship with themselves. And then how do we deal with conflict well? How do we put difficult issues on the table and have them resolved, right? So knowledge work is not just about the stuff we know, it's about the stuff we know in relationship with other people. And it's totally different than working in a factory in some very key ways, right? That the tasks are not clear. You're interrupted all the time. How you're evaluated for many people is not clear. Work, as we said, is intentionally relational. Now with COVID, there's not just weak time-space boundaries, there's no time-space boundary, right? That work can follow you anywhere. And that instead of being bored, we're anxious, right? And that's part of this, how work has been structured. And so if we think about productivity, right? Stress is unrelenting. I can't concentrate because I'm getting interrupted all the time. We have to deal with this greater emotional complexity. There's no structured downtime. You know, the 20th century weekend of leisure for many people doesn't exist, or you have to be really intentional about it. Quality of relationship is intentional, starting with quality of relationship with yourself. And I used to call this the new normal, but now it's the old new normal, right? Now we have a new normal. And how do we manage all of that? How do we create boundary? How do we negotiate relationships in a non-passive aggressive sort of way, right? So, and then there's the human condition, right? That unchanging thing. And I like to think of this work as, you know, all the stuff you were never taught in school that impacts your quality to be effective, right? So first, okay, just a legal disclaimer, I do not own Star Trek. But one thing we're never taught in school is that your survival system overrides your capacity to be rational or to relate to one another. That is like a fundamental human fact, and we do not learn how to do that. In fact, depending on the discipline you're trained in, you learn the exact opposite, right? In law, you learn the principle of the rational man, the reasonable man, right? I'm sure he's not just a man, but in economics, we learn rational actor theory and all of that, right? We teach you the exact opposite of how people are, right? And then we wonder why things go crazy, right? So we have this survival system that overrides or undermines this capacity. And we'll talk much more about that next week. Then you have the attention economy, right? And so let's face it, the attention economy is really the distraction economy. And there's a new documentary on Netflix called The Social Dilemma that talks exactly about this, right? How do we create online addictive processes to steal your attention? And so one of the things we'll talk about in a few weeks is your quality of attention and quality of life are intimately interrelated, right? Quality of attention drives quality of result. And at the same time, we are being distracted at every turn. And so how do I focus on something in a world that's intent on distracting me, right? That's a big challenge we're all facing. Some research done at UCLA, right? Now, all this information coming at us undermines our capacity to process information, right? And that it degrades our ability to resist impulses. And you start to see this showing up in a lot of different places, you know, namely politics, but we don't have to go there. But this incidentally is an argument that's being made for 150 years, starting with the monthly periodical as being too overwhelming in terms of too much information. But I think we do have reached some kind of tipping point in terms of the intensity and human limits to that. So, and then the other thing we never teach you in school is that we're mostly mindless, right? Not only are we not rational conscious actors, we're mostly irrational non-conscious actors. And So what does that look like, right? So I thought you might like some numbers, so we'll talk about some numbers. Okay, 90% of the time we're on autopilot. That's the optimist's view, by the way, right? There are other people who think it's like 99% of the time you're on autopilot. I don't really think they believe that about themselves. They probably believe it about other people. But the fact is, in terms of human neural architecture, focuses primarily on non-conscious automatic processes. 95% of the thoughts you had today, you also had yesterday, right? That's the challenge of long-term marriage, right? So like we're basically kind of rehashing the same grooved thought patterns that we've had all our lives. So another one, you've probably seen this one, 47% of the time your mind is wandering somewhere else. Like even right now, you're probably thinking, why did I sign up for this? What's for dinner? Where, oh, there's something on Netflix right now. So, right, but 47% of the time you're wandering, and where you tend to wander is a bad neighborhood, right? It's a bad neighborhood full of anxiety or doubt or fear. And so how do we start to manage that? Incidentally, William James in 1890 identified exactly the same fact, that the person who can control their attention and bring it back from wandering over and over and over again, right, is the person who masters themselves. And we'll talk about that later. But so when we talk about self-mastery, we're really talking about attention mastery at some level. And then finally, this comes from emotional intelligence research. Less than a third of people can tell you what emotion they're experiencing in a given moment, right? So again, it's like driving without being able to read your gauges, right? If you don't know what you're feeling, how is that influencing the choices that you see that you have, right? Okay, sorry, not finally, there's one more. This also comes from emotional intelligence research. If you lack self-awareness, you have about a 4% chance of managing yourself, right? So if I don't know what I'm doing, if I don't know what I'm feeling, I don't know what I'm thinking, I don't know what assumptions I'm walking into the room with, how can I be effective in that, right? And so again, right, we're operating on autopilot. And if we're blind to what we're experiencing, we're going to default to our habits, like how I've always done things, or my survival patterns. So in the time of VUCA, this intense VUCA, and let's face it, right, this is just the first of what is going to be many things. I can look out my window and see climate change happening, right? The demand for adaptive capacity as a leadership skill and to be able to help other people adapt, really on the fly, right, will become even more important. And so I think about, so when we're talking about mindfulness and all that sort of stuff, it's not really this kind of gooey woo-woo. It's really about cultivating a set of skills that for a large part in this culture have remained undeveloped so that we can transform how we engage with one another, right? How are we engaging with one another? And I think about it like what this does is it transforms what I call the invisible office. Right? So there's the visible office, which is like the computers and the desk and the chairs and the phones and all of that. And then there's the invisible office, which are, the assumptions I have about you, right? Or the grudges I'm holding because you said something in a meeting about a year and a half ago that undermined my project. Or they're the hesitation I have of bringing up a difficult conversation because I don't know how you're going to react to something. One of my students, basically reorganized his entire department to avoid having a difficult conversation with a team member on his team because it terrified him so much, right? So what this does is it shifts the invisible office, right? It changes the unspoken understandings between us. And I think therein lies its power, right? So again, like I ask you, like, what are you putting into your network? Right? And are you conscious of that? And what result is that having? And how do we become more conscious of it? And, like with the person I spoke with earlier, well, let me talk about that in a minute. So why do this stuff, right? I think the world is now nudging us or maybe even shoving us in this direction that, if we're going to come out of all these challenges we're looking at, in good shape, right? We have to up our game. we have to up our game. And so I like to think about that. What these skills do, is that it helps us be more sophisticated in our responses, right? That we're becoming more precise in our responses. Like with the person I was talking to this morning and her difficult colleague, right? She said, I could have easily just lost it, right? But then I stepped back and I realized, okay, I had to thread a different needle. I have to be able to step back from my own emotions. And instead of letting my anger and irritation kind of rule the day, I had to become more skillful and sophisticated in how I dealt with this person, right? And so what we're getting in return for this is a kind of precision and an accuracy and an intentionality and a deliberateness, right, in terms of how we face challenges. And so again, it's not necessarily stress reduction and that sort of thing is just the beginning, right? It's like, okay, after the stress is reduced, what are we going to do, right? How are we going to be together? And that to me is the interesting part. That's the exciting part. So, are we getting more sophisticated in our capacities, or we just run faster and try to get more done, right? Which is for many of us, and for me for many years, our default capacity. So, you can think about it like this, right? You're just running up the curb. I think this is like every type A person, or, is this your mental model of how you're going to get things done? Because if it is, right, and again, kind of going back to the industrial productivity metaphor, right? If they wanted more door hinges done, they just cranked up the speed of the machine, and I had to work faster. And that, for many of us, is our default response. But if we pivot away from thinking about ourselves as machines to thinking about ourselves as biological creatures, which is what we actually are, at least for the moment, right? The reality is something like that, right? We hit a biological limit. And then this survival response that we've been, using energy to keep us going starts to turn on us. And that's where autoimmune disease happens. That's where depression happens. That's where burnout happens. And so the good news is, right, we can turn it all around, right? So how do you bring this into your life? We've gotten hints so far, and let's talk about it. We can start to fill in the blanks. I tell the people I work with that I do not have answers. I only have questions. And my questions are intended to help you find your answers. Right? You have your answers about what's important to you. And what we're going to do is start to fill in the blanks. So how you can start to practice this in daily life, and we can do this right now, is just ask yourself questions. Like, what's happening in your body right now? Like, and for many people, that's a weird question. Like, what do you mean what's happening in my body? Right? So maybe just put your attention on your lower back right now and notice, what does it feel like? What does your lower back feel like? What do your shoulders feel like? Right? What does your jaw feel like? Right? Just notice. So then, right, what emotions are you experiencing? Right? What are the feelings you have? Right? Just notice, what are the emotions that are there? All you have to do is notice. Just let them come and go. You don't have to push them away. They're not your enemy. Sorry, we're running a little bit long, but we're almost done. All right? Just notice what you're feeling. And then what are the stories in your head? Profound regret for signing up for this thing. I could have been doing so much more, right? Like, what are the stories in your head? When that email from your difficult colleague shows up in your inbox, what's the story in your head? Just by asking yourself these questions starts to build up the capacity to sense more clearly what's going on. Right? So at the Drucker School, so in that capacity to sense what's going on, right, it's all about creating different choices. It's all about creating different choices. And what I like to tell people I work with is like, my job is to help you create different and better choices, where before your set of assumptions or judgments didn't see any choices, or your emotional reactions disallowed choices, or because you were feeling uncomfortable in your body, you couldn't, you shut down a set of choices. And so in this day and age, we have to, I think, shift our relationship to what we are experiencing. And when we do that, you create a different future, and we'll talk more about that in the coming weeks. So thank you. The Drucker School, we asked, Peter Drucker was famous for saying, I'm glad you enjoyed the workshop or the program, but what I'm really interested in is what are you going to do differently tomorrow morning? And so I'm kind of curious to know, like, what are you going to do differently tomorrow morning? And if you have questions, I'm happy to stay on a little bit longer to entertain them. It was kind of a whirlwind tour, but it really establishes how I see the world and why I think this stuff is important, and how it can benefit you. And simply just by asking yourself different questions, right? You can start to get a handle and build the skills. And over the next 3 sessions, we'll build those skills even more. So, okay, Alice, I'll be quiet. If there are any questions, happy to entertain them, or comments. Yep.
Deborah is saying that this reminds me of some of Dr. Ellen Langer's work. Are you familiar with her?
Oh, yes, sure. She's the grandmother of mindfulness research in the academy. And her approach is more cognitive, I think, and it focuses on looking for distinctions, but nonetheless, there are a lot of overlapping themes. Mm-hmm.
And then April is asking, will you be talking about the process of that new reality, being aware is happening, but making the change to reduce stress is tough?
Right. So what we're going to do over the next 2 sessions is just build resilience in the nervous system. And in the last session, we'll talk about creating choices.
From Joseph Morandi, how do we remind ourselves to build a habit of noticing sensations and emotions?
Okay. What I like to do is suggest, like, notice when you're actually feeling good, right? Like, what does feeling good feel like? And notice, like, when are the moments during the day you feel calm, or you feel happy, or you feel connected or loved, right? And that paying attention to that, rather than paying attention to when you're in pain, you start to realize that, oh, actually, I'm probably calmer than I realize. But then also, by becoming aware of what feeling good feels like, you start to notice when you don't feel good. And then it just kind of foregrounds itself more naturally. Sarah's question about any suggestion of changing a habit. First of all, yes. So first of all, think about what's a habit you want to change, and then make a tiny little resolution, right? So for example, so actually, to be honest, my great-grandfather's sumo wrestler body is actually, manifesting itself in my own. And so I thought, okay, I got to take care of this. And so I got this ab roller, which I don't know if anybody owns an ab roller, but that's certainly some kind of torture device invented by a sadist. And so to get started, I decided that my goal was to be able to do that once. and that was my practice for like 2 weeks. Could I just do it once? And then I slowly build up to being able to do it every day. And now I think I can do it. Well, let's just say more than once. So, but pick some tiny doable thing. Okay. That almost in the beginning seems irrelevant. But what that does is start to build a neural pathway to make it easier to do it again. Okay. So Ron, your question, how do you interrupt or challenge a negative storyline of the mind? What I do is, and maybe this is intermediate Jedi mind tricks, I'm not sure, is to notice, how does this storyline, how do you experience this storyline in your body? Like, how do you feel this storyline? And then see what happens if you just let yourself feel it without trying to push it away. And I think oftentimes, or at least with a little practice, you find that it goes away. Yeah, we're going to have fun. I mean, this is, to me, you know, learning these skills shouldn't be like eating spinach, you know, like something I know it's good for me and I don't really want to do it. I mean, it should be really an adventure. And because it is, right? You're like understanding this universe inside yourself. And once you start to see how you can work with it, and then even when the results start changing on the outside, that's what makes it really thrilling. Yeah, Douglas, what are some strategies for dealing with the volume of work? Yes, and what are mindful strategies for prioritization? So I think first, again, like that's a great question. That's where resilience in the nervous system is really important, right? So we'll talk about this more next time, but like how do you, sometimes a very basic breathing practice, which we'll talk about, you know, like really becoming more aware of the quality and nature of your breathing, which, you know, in case you can't come to the next episode, breathing through your nose rather than through your mouth is one place to start. And in fact, I'll suggest, somebody asked for some readings, but James Nestor's book, Breath, is fantastic. It's a New York Times bestseller right now. But if you look at some of his longer YouTube interviews, he'll walk you through the whole process. But the primary way we regulate our nervous system, or one of the primary ways, is through the quality of our breathing. And so by building up capacity there, right, we freak out less when there's so much other stuff going
on. With that, we thank you for joining us for almost an hour, and we'll see you next week.
Yep. Thanks. Thank you, everyone.